Most people don't remember the exact moment they decided to care about money. It's usually not dramatic. No big mistake. No sudden disaster. It's something small. Maybe it's standing in a grocery store staring at prices you never used to notice, or checking your bank app late at night, hoping the number looks a little higher than you expect, or realizing that a single unexpected expense could quietly undo months of effort. Nothing is technically wrong, but something feels fragile. That feeling tends to arrive before the numbers make sense, before you know what to do about it, before you even have the language to explain it. And for a lot of people, that's where saving starts. Not with ambition, but with unease. At first, the idea of saving feels almost symbolic. A few dollars set aside, a small buffer, a promise to yourself that you're at least trying. It doesn't feel powerful. It feels cautious. You tell yourself you'll save more later, when things calm down, when income is higher, when life feels more stable. But stability rarely announces itself. Instead, time passes, bills repeat, habits solidify, and money continues to feel like something you're reacting to, not directing. That's why the first meaningful savings milestone is so strange, not because of the number itself, but because of what changes around it. $10,000 isn't a magical amount. It doesn't unlock a new lifestyle. It doesn't make you rich. It doesn't fix everything, but it does something quieter. It changes how the world feels. Before that point, money is mostly defensive. You're protecting yourself from problems, from overdrafts, from late fees, from that constant low-level anxiety that something might go wrong. After that point, something shifts. Not all at once, not dramatically, but noticeably. The same expenses show up, the same paycheck arrives, the same life continues. Yet the pressure feels different. Decisions slow down, reactions soften. Mistakes don't feel as fatal, and most people don't expect that. They assume confidence comes from income, or from investments, or from reaching some distant version of success. But the first real sense of control usually comes earlier, at a moment that looks unimpressive from the outside. $10,000 doesn't change your status, it changes your posture. It's the first time money stops being only a threat, and starts becoming a tool. Up until then, saving often feels like deprivation, like you're saying no to things without a clear reward, like you're delaying life for a future that isn't guaranteed. That's why many people quit before they get there. They don't see the payoff yet. They don't feel the difference yet. So it's easy to believe it's not worth the effort. But the shift isn't about comfort. It's about perspective. When you don't have savings, every choice carries weight. Every purchase competes with every other responsibility. Every unexpected cost feels personal, almost accusatory. It's exhausting, and over time, that exhaustion shapes behavior. You rush decisions. You accept bad trade-offs. You choose short-term relief over long-term stability, not because you want to, but because you're tired. The first $10,000 interrupts that cycle, not by solving the math, but by changing the emotional context in which the math happens. You stop asking, "Can I survive this?" and start asking, "What's the best move here?" That difference is subtle, but it's foundational, and most financial advice skips over it. We talk about investing, we talk about returns, we talk about optimization, but we rarely talk about the moment when money stops feeling like an emergency and starts feeling like a system you can actually think about. That moment doesn't arrive with a six-figure portfolio. It arrives much earlier, quietly, often without celebration. Just a realization that things feel a little less sharp than they used to, a little less urgent, a little more manageable. And once that shift happens, it tends to ripple outward. Not immediately, not obviously, but it begins to influence how you see risk, how you see work, how you see your future self. It's not about what $10,000 can buy. It's about what it gives you permission to think about. And that's where things start to get interesting. Because once the pressure eases, even slightly, your relationship with money begins to change. And understanding that change matters more than the number itself. Most people think the first $10,000 is about security. A cushion, a safety net, something that keeps you from falling too hard. And on paper, that's true. But that framing misses what's actually happening. Saving that amount isn't like building a wall. It's more like turning on a light. When you're operating without savings, everything is dim. You can still move. You can still function. But every step requires more effort. Because you can't fully see what's around you. You're not making worse decisions because you're careless. You're making them because you're navigating in the dark. A small emergency feels large. A minor setback feels permanent. And every choice feels heavier than it should. The money itself doesn't remove obstacles. It changes how clearly you can see them. That clarity is what most people underestimate. There's a psychological shift that happens when your margin grows beyond immediate survival. Your brain stops treating every financial decision as a threat. Scarcity narrows thinking. That's not a moral failing. It's a biological response. When resources feel tight, the mind prioritizes speed over accuracy, relief over strategy, short-term certainty over long-term benefit. That's why advice often feels easier to understand than to follow. It's not that people don't know what they should do. It's that their mental bandwidth is already exhausted. The first meaningful savings milestone restores some of that bandwidth. Not all of it, just enough. Enough to pause. Enough to consider alternatives. Enough to think one step further than the next bill. That pause is valuable. It's the difference between reacting and choosing. And this is where the misunderstanding usually shows up. People imagine saving as a form of self-denial, as something you endure now so you can enjoy later. But the real benefit shows up immediately. Not in lifestyle, in cognition. Think of it like driving with a fogged-up windshield. You can still get where you're going, but everything feels tense. Your shoulders stay tight. Your eyes stay locked on what's right in front of you. Clearing the fog doesn't make the road shorter. It just makes it less stressful to navigate. That's what the first $10,000 does. It reduces mental friction. And when friction drops, behavior changes. You stop overcorrecting. You stop avoiding small decisions because they feel overwhelming. You stop treating money as something that's always on the verge of breaking. Instead, it becomes something you can hold in your mind without panic. This is why people who reach that point often describe a sense of calm they can't quite explain. Nothing dramatic has improved. Their job is the same. Their bills are the same, but the internal noise is lower, and once that noise fades, a new question quietly emerges. Not, how do I get through this month? But what am I actually trying to build? That question doesn't feel urgent. It feels reflective. And reflection changes the direction of effort. Before savings, energy goes into patching leaks. After savings, some of that energy becomes available for design. You begin to notice patterns, where money consistently goes, where stress consistently appears, and you start to see that many of your past decisions weren't mistakes. They were adaptations, reasonable responses to a narrow margin. Understanding that reframes the entire experience. It removes shame. It replaces it with context, and context is what allows people to improve, without feeling like they're fixing something broken. The first $10,000 isn't a finish line, it's a shift in environment, and when the environment changes, behavior follows. Quietly, gradually, often without you realizing it at first. I didn't notice it the day the number actually crossed 10,000. There was no moment of relief, no urge to tell anyone. I didn't even trust the feeling at first. What I noticed came later. It showed up in small pauses, standing in line somewhere, realizing I wasn't mentally rehearsing the consequences of a minor expense, opening an email about a bill and reading it once, instead of skimming it with tension and closing the tab, letting a purchase sit overnight without feeling like the delay itself was a risk. None of that felt important in the moment. But it was different. Before that point, money lived in my head like a constant background process, always running, always consuming attention. Even when things were fine, my thoughts stayed slightly ahead of the present, projecting, calculating, bracing. Reaching that savings milestone didn't shut that voice off. It just lowered the volume. And when the volume dropped, I started noticing how loud it had been. I realized how often I'd rushed decisions not because they were good, but because uncertainty felt expensive. How often I'd chosen familiarity over improvement, because experimenting felt risky. How much of my behavior was shaped by the fear of being wrong at the wrong time. That fear hadn't disappeared, but it stopped dominating. I remember catching myself thinking through a decision slowly and then stopping, almost surprised that I wasn't panicking. That pause felt unfamiliar, not comforting, just new. It made me aware of how much pressure I'd normalized. Up until then, I thought stress was just part of being responsible. That carrying constant concern meant I was paying attention. That relaxing meant I was being careless. But what changed wasn't my standards. It was my margin. With a bit of distance between myself and the edge, I could finally tell the difference. I started questioning choices I'd made on autopilot, not with regret, with curiosity. Why had I accepted certain trade-offs without thinking twice? Why did some expenses feel non-negotiable while others always felt optional? Why did my plans revolve around avoiding mistakes instead of creating opportunities? Those questions hadn't felt safe before. They invited uncertainty, and uncertainty used to feel dangerous. Now it just felt open. That was the most unexpected part. Saving that amount didn't make me confident. It made me honest. Honest about what I'd been avoiding. Honest about what I'd been tolerating. Honest about how much of my financial life was shaped by fear rather than intention. There was no sudden clarity, no breakthrough moment, just a gradual awareness that my thoughts were less reactive, more deliberate. And once I noticed that shift, I couldn't unsee it. It became clear that the number itself hadn't changed me. The space it created had. Once that space exists, even briefly, it starts to influence how you move through ordinary decisions. Not in a dramatic way, more like a slight recalibration. You begin to notice that some choices don't deserve the urgency you used to give them, that not every decision needs to be optimized immediately, that waiting can be a position, not a failure to act. Saving up to that first meaningful buffer quietly teaches this lesson. It shows you that time can work with you instead of against you. With a bit of margin, you're no longer negotiating with panic. You're negotiating with information. You read things more carefully. You ask different questions. You feel less pressure to justify every expense emotionally. And that steadiness carries over. Work decisions feel less reactive. You're not chasing relief as aggressively. You're not mistaking urgency for importance. Even setbacks feel different. An unexpected cost still interrupts your plans. But it doesn't interrupt your identity. It becomes a problem to solve, not a verdict on your judgment. That distinction matters more than it seems. Because when mistakes stop feeling personal, learning becomes possible. You don't need to defend past decisions. You don't need to rush into corrections just to regain control. You can sit with the situation long enough to understand it. That patience changes how you allocate effort. Instead of focusing on avoiding errors, you start focusing on building resilience. Not because someone told you to, but because it feels rational now. You see that stability isn't about predicting every outcome. It's about having enough room to respond when things don't go as planned. And that understanding naturally reshapes priorities. Spending becomes less about comfort and more about alignment. Saving becomes less about restriction and more about continuity. Work becomes less about survival and more about leverage. None of this happens overnight. There's no checklist to complete. No single habit that unlocks the shift. It's more like gravity slowly asserting itself. Once you've experienced a bit of financial stillness, you begin to recognize when something disrupts it, and you start valuing that stillness more than you expected. Not as a luxury, as a baseline. That's the quiet power of the first $10,000. It doesn't demand discipline. It rewards awareness. And once that awareness takes hold, it tends to influence decisions long after the number itself stops feeling significant. By the time people look back on it, the first $10,000 rarely stands out as an achievement. It doesn't mark a transformation others can see. It doesn't come with proof or recognition. What it marks is quieter. It's the point where money stops dominating every internal conversation, where decisions feel less compressed by fear, where the future stops feeling like a threat you're constantly bracing for. Nothing about life becomes perfect after that. Problems still appear. Uncertainty still exists, but the relationship changes. Money becomes something you can think with, not something that constantly thinks for you. And that shift carries a kind of dignity that's easy to overlook. It allows you to move through choices with a bit more patience, to make mistakes without spiraling, to plan without needing guarantees. That's why the number itself fades in importance. What stays is the sense of footing. The knowledge that you're not always one step away from losing control. For many people, that's the first time financial life feels inhabitable rather than hostile. And once you've felt that difference, even briefly, it tends to recalibrate what you value. Not extravagance, not speed, but steadiness. The first $10,000 doesn't change everything because of what it buys. It changes everything because of what it removes. The noise, the urgency, the constant background tension. What's left isn't confidence or ambition. It's clarity. And clarity, once experienced, quietly reshapes how you move forward.